Have you ever wanted to see angels? Have you prayed for visions, for signs, for something beyond the ordinary silence of faith? Have you ever felt that if God would just give you one clear spiritual experience, then everything would finally make sense? Throughout the 20th century, thousands traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo in southern Italy to meet a man who carried wounds that bled for 50 years. They came because Padre Pio saw things no one else could see. He spoke with angels. He smelled sins on people before they confessed. He appeared in 2 places at once. Witnesses documented bilocation events across continents. Military pilots during World War II swore they saw him in the sky, turning their planes away from targets. Doctors examined his stigmata and found no medical explanation. The blood that soaked through his fingerless gloves every day for half a century came from wounds that never healed and never infected. But here is what most people never learned about Padre Pio. He did not want any of it. He begged God to take the stigmata away. He asked his superiors to forbid him from hearing confessions, so he could escape the crush of people. He wept when souls appeared to him in his cell at night because the visions terrified him and stole his sleep. And when people came to him asking how they could receive the same gifts, how they could see what he saw, he gave them an answer that confused them. He told them to stop asking. If you value documented history and verified accounts like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the published transcripts of Padre Pio's letters to his spiritual directors, held in the archives of the Capuchin Postulation in Rome, and from the sworn testimonies given during his beatification process between 1997 and 1999, testimonies that required witnesses to speak under oath before a diocesan tribunal. These are not popular retellings. These are canonical documents. Now back to the information. Padre Pio told his spiritual children the same thing over and over. He said, "Do not seek extraordinary graces. Seek only to do the will of God." He said, "The devil can give you visions. He cannot give you obedience." He said, "A person who runs after spiritual experiences is like a child who abandons his mother to chase a butterfly. The butterfly is beautiful, but the child gets lost." His own life proved the point in a way that most people never understood. Francesco Forgione was born on May 25, 1887 in Pietrelcina, a small mountain town in the province of Benevento. His family was poor. His father worked as a laborer and later emigrated twice to the United States to send money home. Francesco was sickly from childhood, suffered chronic respiratory problems, and was often bedridden. He entered the Capuchin novitiate at Morcone in January 1903 at the age of 15. He took the name Pio after Pope Pius V. He was ordained a priest on August 10, 1910, in the Cathedral of Benevento. Nothing about his early years suggested what was coming. He was quiet, obedient, often ill. His superiors noted his piety, but also his fragile health. He spent years moving between friaries and his family home because tuberculosis was suspected, though never confirmed. In 1916, he was assigned to the Friary of San Giovanni Rotondo on the Gargano Peninsula, a remote and windswept place far from the cities. He arrived in July. He was 29 years old. He expected to stay a few months. He never left. 2 years later, on September 20th, 1918, Padre Pio was praying alone in the choir of the small friary church. It was Friday morning. He was kneeling before a wooden crucifix. What happened next was documented in his own letters written within days to his spiritual director, Father Benedetto of San Marco in Lamis. Padre Pio described a vision of a figure who pierced his hands, feet, and side with a lance of fire. He wrote, "I felt I was dying. I thought I would die." When the vision ended, he looked down and saw blood pouring from his hands. The wounds had opened in the exact locations of Christ's crucifixion wounds. They would bleed every day for the next 50 years, until the morning of his death in 1968. But here is what matters. Padre Pio did not announce it. He did not show anyone. He tried to hide the wounds under his sleeves and wrap them in cloth. He begged Father Benedetto to ask God to remove them, or at least to make them invisible. He wrote, "I will certainly die of shame if the Lord does not hear my prayer and take away not the wound or the pain, which is impossible, but these outward signs which cause me unbearable embarrassment and humiliation." The superior of the friary discovered the wounds only because Padre Pio's bandages began soaking through his habit during Mass. Word spread among the friars. Then it spread to the town. Then it spread across Italy. By 1919, thousands of people were arriving every month to see the stigmatized priest. The Italian government sent doctors to examine him. The Vatican sent investigators. Padre Pio's life became a storm of attention, suspicion, examination, and control. And through all of it, Padre Pio said the same thing to everyone who asked him how it felt to carry the wounds of Christ. He said, "Pray for obedience. That is the only thing that matters." In 1923, the Vatican imposed severe restrictions on Padre Pio. The Holy Office, the doctrinal office of the Church that investigated miracles and heresies, issued a decree forbidding him from celebrating Mass in public, from showing his wounds, from writing or receiving letters, and from having contact with lay people outside of sacramental confession. The restrictions were based on suspicions that the stigmata might be self-inflicted or the result of psychological illness. Padre Pio accepted the decree without protest. He obeyed immediately. For 2 years, he lived in near isolation inside the friary, stripped of nearly all priestly activity. One of his brother Capuchins, Father Agostino of San Marco in Lamis, wrote in his diary that Padre Pio never once complained about the restrictions. He never questioned the decision of the Holy Office. He never defended himself publicly. He simply obeyed. Father Agostino wrote, "He told me that if the Church wanted him to stop breathing, he would try. The restrictions were lifted in 1925 after further investigation, but the lesson Padre Pio learned from those years shaped everything he taught afterward. He told people that the wounds were not the gift. The gift was being allowed to suffer them in obedience. He said, 'If I had received the stigmata outside the will of my superiors, I would have known they came from the devil.'" This is the part of Padre Pio's story that almost no one talks about. The spiritual experiences that defined him were experiences he did not want, did not seek, and repeatedly tried to refuse. And when he spoke to lay people and priests who came to him wanting the same kind of closeness to God, he told them to stop thinking about visions and start thinking about small daily obedience. One woman who visited Padre Pio in the early 1930s, identified in the beatification testimony records only as Cleonice Morcaldi, testified that she asked him how she could grow closer to God. She expected him to tell her to pray more, to fast, to read scripture, to meditate. Instead, Padre Pio asked her, "Are you kind to your husband?" She said yes. He asked, "Do you obey your confessor?" She said yes. He asked, "Do you complain when things are hard?" She hesitated. Padre Pio nodded and said, "Then do not ask for spiritual experiences. Ask for the grace to stop complaining. That is harder than seeing an angel." Cleonice Morcaldi later wrote that the answer devastated her because it was so simple and so true. She realized she had been treating spiritual life like a ladder where visions and ecstasies were the high rungs, and daily obedience was the boring part you had to get through. Padre Pio was telling her the opposite. The boring part was the point. The rest was decoration. The truth about Padre Pio's mystical gifts becomes even clearer when you look at the specific experiences he endured and how little consolation they brought him. His letters to his spiritual directors between 1910 and 1922 contain over 600 pages of descriptions of spiritual phenomena. These letters were kept sealed in the archives of the Capuchin order until 1994, when they were finally published under the editorship of Melchiorre of Pobladura and Alessandro of Ripabatoni. They reveal a man who was tormented, not blessed, by what he saw. In a letter dated November 15, 1912, Padre Pio wrote to Father Benedetto describing an encounter with his guardian angel. He explained that the angel appeared to him regularly, often in the middle of the night, to translate foreign letters sent to him by spiritual children who wrote in English or French. Padre Pio did not speak these languages fluently. He wrote, "The angel appears and reads the letter to me in Italian so I can respond. But his presence fills me with such terror that I shake for hours afterward. I do not know why I am afraid. He is beautiful and gentle, but I feel unworthy to be near him." Father Benedetto wrote back, asking why the angel's presence caused fear if he was sent by God. Padre Pio responded in a letter dated November 23, 1912. He said, "Because when the angel is near me, I see myself as I truly am. I see every sin, every failure, every moment I have disappointed God. The light he carries shows me the truth, and the truth is unbearable." This was not the mysticism people imagined. This was not peaceful visions and warm feelings. Padre Pio described the presence of heavenly beings as a mirror that forced him to confront his own sinfulness. He said the experience left him weeping and exhausted. He begged Father Benedetto to ask God to stop sending the angel. Father Benedetto refused. He told Padre Pio that the fear he felt was a gift because it kept him humble. Padre Pio's encounters with demons were even more brutal. His letters describe physical attacks that occurred almost nightly between 1910 and 1920. In one letter, dated January 9, 1913, he wrote, "Last night, the devils beat me from 11 at night until 5 in the morning. They appeared as black dogs and threw me from my bed. They tore my shirt and left bruises on my arms and back. When I tried to pray, they screamed in my ears so loudly I could not hear my own voice." Father Agostino documented several of these attacks in his personal diary. On February 2, 1913, he wrote that he heard loud crashes coming from Padre Pio's cell at 3 in the morning. He ran to the room and found Padre Pio on the floor, bleeding from his mouth and nose. The furniture was overturned. The crucifix on the wall had been torn down. Padre Pio was barely conscious. Father Agostino asked what had happened. Padre Pio whispered, "They said I belonged to them." These were not isolated incidents. They continued for years. In June 1915, another friar, Father Paolino of Casacalenda, recorded that Padre Pio told him the demons appeared every night without fail. Father Paolino asked why God allowed it. Padre Pio said, "I do not know. But I know that if I did not obey my superiors during the day, I would have no strength to resist the demons at night. Obedience is my only weapon." This is the detail that shatters the romanticized version of mysticism. Padre Pio believed that his daily acts of obedience, small and boring and repetitive, were the source of the grace that protected him during the spiritual battles at night. He did not fight demons with visions. He fought them with submission to the rule of his order, with punctuality at prayers, with acceptance of his superiors' decisions. He said, "The devil fears a Capuchin who obeys more than a Capuchin who works miracles." If you are still watching, thank you. Drop a comment and let us know where you are hearing this from. Now back to the story. Padre Pio's own mystical experiences were never peaceful. They were almost always terrifying, exhausting, and physically violent. But what tortured him even more than the demonic attacks were the visions of souls. He saw souls constantly. He saw souls of the living and the dead. He saw souls in purgatory who came to him begging for prayers. He saw souls in mortal sin standing next to him in the confessional. He saw souls of people who were about to die. And he saw the state of each soul with absolute clarity, a clarity that left him weeping. One of the spiritual daughters of Padre Pio, a woman named Pia Forgione, no relation, testified in the beatification process that Padre Pio once told her, "If you saw what I see every day, you would never smile again." She asked him what he meant. He said, "I see souls falling into hell like snowflakes falling in winter, and I cannot stop it." Another witness, Father Alessio Parente, a Capuchin friar who lived with Padre Pio for many years, testified that Padre Pio told him he often saw souls of people in the congregation during Mass who were in mortal sin. He could see the sin like a shadow around them. Father Alessio asked him, "Does it distract you?" Padre Pio answered, "It crushes me." This is the detail that breaks the fantasy version of Padre Pio's life. People imagine that seeing souls, seeing angels, seeing into the spiritual realm would be beautiful and consoling. Padre Pio said it was unbearable. He said the hardest part of the stigmata was not the physical pain. It was being unable to hide from what God allowed him to see. In 1947, a man named Alberto Del Fante visited Padre Pio and asked him directly, "Father, is it true you can read souls?" Padre Pio looked at him and said, "I wish I could not." Del Fante, who later wrote a memoir of the visit, asked why. Padre Pio said, "Because once you see the state of a soul, you cannot stop praying for it. And most of them do not want help." Del Fante pressed him. He said, "But Father, do you not think it is a gift to see what others cannot see?" Padre Pio responded, "A gift is something you can give back. This is a weight." The reason Padre Pio spoke this way is because he understood something that most people who chase spiritual experiences do not understand. Mystical gifts are not rewards, they are responsibilities. And the closer you get to seeing the truth of the spiritual world, the heavier the burden becomes. Padre Pio once said, "I would trade every vision I have ever had for one moment of pure obedience without knowing why I obeyed." That sentence sits at the center of everything he taught. Obedience without understanding, obedience without consolation, obedience when it feels dry, pointless, and small. Padre Pio said that kind of obedience was worth more than 1,000 ecstasies, because it required faith, not feeling. One of the most detailed testimonies about Padre Pio's teaching on this subject came from Father Joseph Pius Martin, an Irish-American Capuchin who served as Padre Pio's assistant and confessor in the final years of his life. Father Joseph Pius testified in 2003, years after Padre Pio's canonization, and his account was recorded in the archives of the Irish Capuchin province. He described a conversation that took place in April 1967, about a year and a half before Padre Pio died. A young priest had come to San Giovanni Rotondo hoping to meet Padre Pio. The priest was discouraged because he felt his prayer life was dry and empty. He told Father Joseph Pius that he wanted to experience God the way Padre Pio did. He wanted a sign that his priesthood mattered. Father Joseph Pius brought the priest to Padre Pio's cell. Padre Pio was seated in a chair, weak and in pain. His stigmata were bleeding through his gloves. He could barely stand. The young priest knelt and said, "Father, I feel so far from God. I pray and feel nothing. I say Mass and feel nothing. I want to feel what you feel." Padre Pio looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You want my wounds?" The priest hesitated and then said, "I want your faith." Padre Pio shook his head slowly. He said, "You do not want my faith. You want my feelings. Faith is obeying when you feel nothing." Father Joseph Pius testified that the priest started to cry. He said, "But Father, how do I know God hears me?" Padre Pio answered, "You do not. That is what obedience means." Then he said something that Father Joseph Pius repeated many times in interviews. Padre Pio said, "The devil wants you to chase experiences because experiences make you proud. Obedience makes you small, and God only comes to the small." Padre Pio himself lived that teaching in ways that became famous but were rarely explained correctly. He spent up to 16 hours a day in the confessional. He heard confessions from 4 in the morning until noon, and then again from 3 in the afternoon until late evening. He heard confessions in Italian, in local dialects, in broken English and Latin when necessary. He heard the confessions of laborers, soldiers, intellectuals, mafiosi, politicians, prostitutes, children, priests. He did this every day for 50 years, despite chronic pain, infections in his wounds, severe arthritis, and eventually lung disease that made breathing difficult. People traveled from across Europe and later from across the world to confess to Padre Pio because word spread that he could see into the soul. Thousands of testimonies describe the same experience. A penitent would kneel in the confessional and begin to speak, and Padre Pio would interrupt and name a sin the person had not mentioned. Or he would say, "You are hiding something. Tell me now." Or he would refuse absolution until the person confessed a specific act they had buried in shame for years. People left his confessional weeping, not because he was harsh, but because he knew, he saw. But what most people did not understand is that this ability tortured Padre Pio. Father Alessio Parente testified that Padre Pio told him, "Every soul that comes to me leaves something of its darkness in me. I carry it until I can pray it away." Father Alessio asked, "How long does that take?" Padre Pio said, "Sometimes hours, sometimes days. Sometimes I am still carrying souls I heard 40 years ago." This was not a figure of speech. Padre Pio experienced the spiritual state of the people who confessed to him as a physical weight. Other friars reported that after long days in the confessional, Padre Pio would return to his cell and collapse. He would lie on his cot and groan as if he were carrying something too heavy to bear. Father Agostino wrote that one evening in 1928, he heard Padre Pio crying in his cell and asked if he was in pain. Padre Pio said, "I'm carrying 3 souls who will not let me go." Yet despite this unbearable burden, Padre Pio stayed in the confessional. He obeyed his superiors who assigned him the work. He obeyed the demands of the people who came. He obeyed even when his body screamed for rest. That obedience, Padre Pio said, was the only thing that kept him sane. He said, "If I stayed in the confessional because I wanted to, I would go mad. I stay because I am told to stay. That is the difference." In 1960, a group of laypeople in San Giovanni Rotondo wrote a petition asking the provincial superior to reduce Padre Pio's hours in the confessional. They were worried he would die from exhaustion. The petition was ignored. Padre Pio himself never asked for a reduction. When someone asked him why he did not request lighter duties, he said, "Who am I to decide what God wants from me? My superior decides. I obey." This is the part of Padre Pio's spirituality that modern people find hardest to accept. He did not speak about personal discernment, listening to your heart, finding your own path. He spoke about obedience to authority, submission to the will of superiors, and distrust of your own feelings. He told people that the voice of your superior was more reliable than the voice of an angel, because the devil can imitate an angel, but he cannot imitate lawful authority acting within the church. One of Padre Pio's most repeated sayings was, "It is better to obey a bad superior than to follow a good feeling." He said this not because he believed superiors were always right, but because he believed obedience protected you from the pride that comes from trusting your own judgment. He said, "When you obey, you give God your will. When you follow a spiritual experience, you keep your will and just dress it up in holy language." The test of this teaching came in the most painful moment of Padre Pio's life. In July 1961, the Vatican imposed a second wave of restrictions on him. This time, the accusations were more serious. Anonymous complaints had been sent to Rome claiming that Padre Pio was financially corrupt, that he was too familiar with women, that he was manipulating laypeople for personal gain, and that the atmosphere around him was hysterical and dangerous. The accusations were investigated by Monsignor Carlo Maccari, an official sent by the Holy Office. Maccari's report, later declassified, concluded that while the most serious accusations were false, the situation at San Giovanni Rotondo was problematic and required correction. In June 1962, the Holy Office issued a new decree. Padre Pio was forbidden from celebrating Mass in public, except for one early morning Mass with a small group of friars present. He was forbidden from meeting privately with laypeople, He was forbidden from blessing people. He was forbidden from hearing the confessions of women under the age of 40. His mail was monitored. His phone calls were restricted. He was placed under surveillance by Vatican officials. Padre Pio accepted every restriction without a word of protest. Father Joseph Pius Martin testified that on the day the decree was read aloud to the community, Padre Pio sat in silence. After the reading, he stood, kissed the hand of the superior who had read the decree, and said, "The will of the Church is the will of God." He went to his cell. He did not complain. He did not defend himself. He obeyed. Over the next 2 years, the restrictions devastated the people who depended on Padre Pio. Thousands of lay people who traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo were turned away. Women who had confessed to Padre Pio for decades were told they could no longer see him. The small friary church, which had been packed every morning for his Mass, was nearly empty. Padre Pio continued his one permitted Mass each day at 5 in the morning. He prayed. He obeyed. Father Alessio Parente later wrote that during those years, Padre Pio seemed more at peace than he had been in decades. He said, "It was as if the restrictions freed him from the burden of being seen. He told me, 'Now I can just be a priest again.'" The restrictions were quietly lifted in 1964, but Padre Pio never spoke about them publicly. He never expressed bitterness. When someone asked him years later how he endured the Vatican investigation, he said, "I did what I was told, that is all." This is the core of what Padre Pio taught about spiritual experiences versus obedience. Experiences come and go, visions fade, feelings change, but obedience remains. Obedience is the skeleton that holds you upright when every other support is taken away. Padre Pio said, "When you obey, you prove you trust God more than you trust yourself. When you seek experiences, you prove you trust yourself more than you trust God." There is another layer to Padre Pio's teaching that becomes clear only when you examine how he responded to people who claim to have their own mystical experiences. He was not impressed. He was suspicious. In 1953, a woman came to him claiming that the Virgin Mary had appeared to her and given her a message for the world. She wanted Padre Pio to confirm that the vision was real. She described the vision in detail, the light, the feeling of peace, the words spoken. Padre Pio listened in silence. When she finished, he asked her one question. "Did the Virgin tell you to obey your confessor?" The woman hesitated and said, "She told me to spread her message." Padre Pio said, "Then it was not the Virgin." The woman was shocked. She insisted the vision was real. Padre Pio said, "The devil can show you light. He can give you peace. He can speak beautiful words, but he cannot make you obey. If your vision does not lead you to obedience, it is not from God." Father Alessio Parente recorded this conversation in his memoir published in 2005. He wrote that Padre Pio applied the same test to every claimed vision, apparition, or locution. He always asked, "What did it tell you to do?" If the answer involved anything other than obedience to lawful authority, humility, and service to others, Padre Pio dismissed it as either imagination or demonic deception. This was not theoretical for Padre Pio. He knew from his own life how easy it was to be deceived by spiritual experiences. In a letter to Father Agostino, dated August 6, 1914, Padre Pio described a terrifying incident. He wrote that a figure appeared to him during prayer claiming to be Jesus. The figure spoke with authority and commanded Padre Pio to do a specific penance that would have harmed his health. Padre Pio nearly obeyed, but at the last moment he decided to ask his superior for permission first. When he described the vision to his superior, the superior immediately recognized it as demonic and forbade the penance. Padre Pio wrote, "If I had not asked permission, I would have obeyed the devil thinking I was obeying Christ. This taught me that no vision, no matter how beautiful, is safe unless it passes through obedience." This experience shaped how Padre Pio spoke to others for the rest of his life. He told people to distrust their own spiritual experiences until they had been tested by obedience. He said, "If you have a vision and your superior tells you to ignore it, ignore it. If the vision was from God, he will not be offended that you obeyed your superior. If it was from the devil, you have just defeated him." In his final years, Padre Pio's mystical experiences became less frequent, but his suffering increased. His stigmata still bled daily, but the wounds caused severe infections. His lungs deteriorated from decades of respiratory illness and the stress of endless work. He developed severe arthritis in his hands and feet. Walking became agonizing. Saying Mass required help from other friars to lift the chalice and turn the pages of the Missal. But Padre Pio continued. He continued hearing confessions until weeks before his death. He continued saying Mass every morning. He continued obeying his superior's schedule, even when his body barely functioned. On September 22, 1968, Padre Pio said his last Mass. He was too weak to stand for most of it. He sat on a chair and whispered the words of consecration. After Mass, he returned to his cell. He prayed the rosary. He He kissed the wounds on his hands. He said to the friar attending him, "I see the Madonna." He died early the next morning, September 23rd, 1968, at 2:30 a.m. He was 81 years old. Within hours, the stigmata disappeared. The wounds that had bled for 50 years closed completely and left no scars. Witnesses who prepared his body for burial testified that his hands were smooth, as if the wounds had never existed. Doctors who examined his body later confirmed it. There were no marks. Padre Pio's body was buried in the crypt of the church at San Giovanni Rotondo. In 2008, 40 years after his death, his body was exhumed for the beatification process. It was found partially incorrupt. The face and hands were preserved. The rest had decomposed naturally. The body was placed in a glass reliquary in the new shrine church built to accommodate the millions of pilgrims who visit every year. But the final detail about Padre Pio's teaching on obedience versus spiritual experience comes from a letter he wrote to one of his spiritual daughters in 1965, 3 years before his death. The letter was discovered in the archives of the monastery and published in the collection of his correspondence edited by Gerardo di Flumeri in 2007. The woman had written asking Padre Pio to pray that God would give her a mystical experience so she could feel close to him. Padre Pio wrote back one sentence. He said, "You are already close to God when you obey. The rest is vanity." And here's the detail that changes everything. In 2001, during the final stages of Padre Pio's canonization process, the tribunal reviewed every documented miracle attributed to him. They counted over 3,000 verified healings, bilocations, prophecies, and supernatural events. But buried in the tribunal's final report was a statistic that almost no one noticed. Of the 3,000 miracles, fewer than 50 occurred during moments when a Padre Pio was in ecstasy or experiencing a vision. The vast majority, over 2,900, occurred during ordinary moments, while he was hearing confessions, while he was walking down a hallway, while he was eating in silence in the refectory, while he was doing nothing remotely mystical at all. The miracles came through obedience, not through visions,